Hello and welcome to this video. In this video, we are going to take a look at consuming events that are coming out of VMware vSphere and onto a containerized application that is bite-sized on VMware Tanzu, runs in a Kubernetes cluster that will scale out when an event occurs that is of interest, or that service will scale to 0 when there is no event. All of this is done using Cloud Native Runtimes by VMware Tanzu. So let's take a look at how this is done. Now, to do all of this, we'll need a VMware vSphere environment where there's a vCenter server that is managing a bulk of your infrastructure. And we have VMware Tanzu's Cloud Native Runtime deployed on a Kubernetes cluster. This Kubernetes cluster could be anything. Now, to start off with, we'll create something called as a broker. A broker is a CRD type created by Cloud Native Runtime, and we'll call this as a default broker. Think of a broker as somebody who is listening to it on one side and then delivering it to a completely different entity. Now, because we want to listen to VMware vSphere, we need credentials to authenticate ourselves against that VMware vSphere. So we'll need to create a Kubernetes secret type where we list out our VMware vSphere credentials. And then we'll be creating a vSphere source type. Again, this is a CRD element created using Cloud Native Runtimes. This is pre-packaged as part of Cloud Native Runtime. And what that vSphere source is going to do is it's going to take the credentials that we created using the secret, authenticate itself against the vCenter API, and then start listening to the events coming from there and delivering them to the broker. Now we have, the events streaming into our Kubernetes cluster. We can do all kinds of things with those events. We can create a service that, does an actionable step on top of those events. We can listen to those events. We can stream them further, etc. To do so, we'll need a consumer service. So again, this will be a CRD type. This is exactly using Knative serving. We're going to create a service that we can that will do something to these events or act upon these events. Now there's a whole bulk of events that is coming out of VMware vSphere. There's at least a gazillion of event types that are coming through that broker. So we can filter out these events based on a trigger. Now we might be interested in very specific events that are coming from VMware vSphere. So for example, only do something when a host is about to shut down, or a host is not working, or a virtual machine does a vMotion, or tag a virtual machine with something when somebody creates a new virtual machine and things like that. So all kinds of things. But to do so, you need to listen to these sources and create the appropriate trigger. So that's what we are going to do. You can create multiple triggers. So if you have more than one kind of source that you're interested in, you could create as many triggers you want through the same broker, and then create multiple consumer services that that will do something based on those triggers. So that's it. This is how we are going to configure stream events coming in from vSphere into our VMware Tanzu cluster using Cloud Native Runtimes. Let's actually practically walk through this using a demo. Now for this demo, I have a vCenter server. You can see it on the left-hand side. This is my vSphere over here. I also have a TKG cluster created, a Kubernetes cluster using TKG. In fact, that Kubernetes cluster is actually running on the same vSphere, and I've just built it over there. I have also deployed Cloud Native Runtimes on top of that Kubernetes cluster, and we can see that using this Octant Kubernetes dashboard over here. I also have the Knative plugin so that we can see all the different services as we start creating them. You'll see that there's nothing much happening over here, but there are these different namespaces that were created as a result of deploying the Cloud Native Runtime. So you'll see Knative serving, Knative eventing deployed, and also VMware sources deployed onto this Kubernetes cluster. So I'm going to go back to the default namespace. There is nothing much happening in terms of custom resources over here, but as we start deploying our brokers and event triggers, etc., you'll start seeing them created within the web UI over here. So to start off with, we first need to create a credential for VMware vSphere. So this is a simple YAML file where I'm going to create a vSphere credential, and I'm going to just go ahead and do that. So that's the secret that we need to create. And then we'll go ahead and create a simple broker. The broker I'm going to use will be called default. There's not much. You can even use the Knative CLI to create this broker. I'm just showing the YAML file so that we get a sense of what's going on in the backend. So I'm going to start creating this broker now. So I just created that broker. You'll see these custom resources popping up, and the default broker is created and ready for us. Now let's create the vSphere source event type. And for that, we have this file over here where I'm just the kind of the service that I'm trying to create is a vSphere source. Now the vSphere source CRD is already pre-deployed as part of the Cloud Native Runtime. So when I deploy this, the cluster knows what to do with it. And then within that YAML file, I'm just pointing it to my vCenter server and asking it to point to these credentials, and then forwarding all the events into the default broker that we just created. So let's apply this. So as we start applying that, you'll see that the vSphere sources have been created. The last line over here is created. The state of this vSphere source is also ready. So now our sources are coming in, we can actually start creating a consumer for these events. We can also take a look at the source. There will be a pod deployed for all the sources that are coming in. So this is that pod that is pulling in everything from vSphere. And if you look at its log, you'll actually see it talking to the vSphere, logging in, connecting to the API, and talking back up. So let's go back to custom resources. So you'll see vSphere sources have been created, some bindings and brokers were created. Now let's create a consumer service. So I'm going to use this service type, which is a Knative service, and this is simply using a sockeye container, which is going to just display all the coming in events into a web portal. So I'm going to create that. So that service was just created, and we'll see that in the custom resources page. Okay, so the sockeye image service was created. Now we have a consumer that is just going to display whatever trigger is coming up. That's what this service does. But now we need to create a trigger which can bind the broker to and filter out events to this consumer. Now to do so, I'm going to create a trigger, and we can create multiple triggers. We can filter those triggers. So for example, in this YAML, I'm creating a trigger for eventing type in Knative, and I'm going to filter this based on these attributes. I'm going to say wherever the source, the cloud event that is coming in that broker is of this type, please display this out. So let's go ahead and create this trigger. All right, so now we have that trigger created as well. So on the left hand side, you can see we have that trigger pointing to or connecting to our sockeye from the broker with this particular matching label. So now let's look at that service and see whether we get any events yet. So you'll see right now there is nothing much happening because we filtered for a very specific event type called VM create event. Unless somebody creates a virtual machine, this service, or we won't be able to see anything. And in fact, after the service has been spun up, when there is no event for a certain type for a certain time, that service will actually be scaled down to 0. And that's the that's the best thing about this is all these consumer services can be scaled down to 0 if they're a Knative service type. So let's go ahead and create a virtual machine and see whether that event comes through. So I'm going to create a new virtual machine. I'm just going with the defaults and I'm going to let that event come through. So now if I go back to my sockeye, you'll see that that event is actually coming up and we instantly can see it in our container image. So this is how, we can actually take a vSphere event and filter it based on its type and consume it as a service. Now for this demo, we were just using Sockeye to display the event, but you can actually do multiple things with it. You can actually use vSphere bindings to and a job within vSphere to actually create an action on a specific event. So let's say you saw some virtual machine being created and you want to tag it with a specific tag. You could actually use the vSphere Go, vMomi, or any other SDK type that you're comfortable with, create a container, and then use the vSphere credentials to actually then bind a service to create a tag within vSphere. There are multiple things you can do with it, and the Tanzu VMware sources for Knative page has great examples on how to do some of these things, so do check it out. So that's that for this demo. Thank you for watching it.